All right, so we're going to start on French Revolution Notes 2. Um, and we'll start with August to October 1791. This is where the revolution begins to accelerate from being kind of a moderate, sort of democratic government to a more kind of radicalized government where the paranoia really ramps up, where the divisiveness really ramps up, and where, in general, um, they start to accelerate towards more violence as well. The first event, if you look at the top of the outline, is the Declaration of Pillnitz. It's actually the Declaration of Pillnite. I misspelled that, so it's Pillnite. But the gist of the Declaration of Pillnite is this: Frederick of Prussia, who was the King of Prussia, and Leopold, the King of the Holy Roman Empire, basically said to the National Assembly, if you hurt the king and his family, then we're going to come in like hellfire and, beat you up in a war and put the king back on the throne. So the Declaration of Pillnite was kind of the first time that foreign powers interfered with the democratic process in France. And what it did was kind of the opposite of what it was intended. It actually made the National Assembly more antagonistic against the king and made the National Assembly paranoid and fearful of foreign invasion. And it really ramped up the push towards violence, which was the exact opposite intent of these kings. And it's kind of a goofy thing for them to do because I know, for instance, myself, if somebody threatens me with something, I tend to dig my feet in and become more antagonistic. And that's kind of what the National Assembly did. Very few people respond to threats. Certainly very few governments who are kind of proud of what they're trying to achieve respond to threats by saying, okay, we're going to become, docile and do exactly what you want, foreign enemy, Holy Roman Empire, foreign enemy, Prussia, So in a sense, their intention was to kind of subdue the National Assembly, but really what it did was kind of, ramped up the paranoia and, it ramped up the push kind of in their minds towards a more violent type of period. Next on the list is the Feuillants. The Feuillants are kind of the most right wing of the political parties that occupy the National Assembly at this point. And at some point, I'm going to have to take you through the clubs and the splits and all that kind of stuff. But all you really need to know is that the Feuillants were kind of the political party that was most affiliated with the king in keeping things kind of status quo in France and kind of, making a new democratic government, but one that was kind of closer to what had been before with, nobles and royals and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, the Declaration of the Nobility prohibited nobility, but the Feuillants wanted to kind of keep France sort of the same. So being kind of right wing and being kind of, in charge of the assembly at that point, they tried to prohibit all other political parties from forming. And again, it was very much like the Declaration of Pillnitz. By trying to prohibit freedom of expression and more kind of left-wing liberal clubs, what they ended up doing was doing exactly opposite what they wanted, which was they kind of radicalized people and pushed people towards the left and the more kind of radical liberal thoughts and ideas of the revolution. So the Feuillants, by trying to prohibit clubs, actually intensified the rhetoric and made the clubs much more liberal and made the clubs, much more entrenched at this point. Okay, now we come to the new constitution. They actually finished the first constitution of the newly found French Republic in October of 1791. So the new constitution basically is democratic. It's more democratic than France was, but only 10% of the population gets to weigh in with their vote. So that's not super democratic. It's very moderate, kind of right. conservative democratic. Okay, so it went from the king and the nobility having full say to 10% of the population, land owning men having a say. So it was more democratic than it was prior to the revolution, but it certainly wasn't, liberal or, intensely democratic. So it represented 10% of the population, and it represented those 10% of the population had 50% of the wealth of the country. So these were still well-off folks who were having a say in the government. And so the one thing that you should get down about the new Constitution is that by the time it was signed into law, it had already been kind of outdated by the direction of the National Assembly was going. So what I mean by that is it was a very kind of moderate, conservative, moderate constitution, just as the National Assembly began to kind of radicalize and go more liberal. So the gist of the things that happened from August to October 1791, the Declaration of Pilnite, the Feuillants prohibiting clubs, and the new Constitution, all were sort of conservative, sort of moderate times. And the revolution was pushing at this point towards a more liberal time period. And if you have any questions or concerns about this, we can talk about it in class. But that's kind of the overview of what happened during those months. From October to December 1791, things begin to radicalize in the National Assembly. At that point, in October of 1791, there were 136 Jacobins, so people who declared to be sort of liberal. There were 264 Feuillants, people who had declared to be sort of conservative. And there were 400 uncommitted representatives. So there were 400 folks in the National Assembly who were not part of the real left Jacobins, okay, the liberal aspect of the revolution, and not part of the 264 Feuillants, the real right aspect. So these 400 reps were kind of up for grabs, and the Jacobins and the Feuillants were going to try to recruit people to join their party from this 400 uncommitted. At this point, a new political party starts. They're called the Girondins. And the Girondins' initial kind of political statement was that they were going to be pro-war. They were going to be in favor of the idea of going out and attacking foreign enemies who had threatened them. So the Austrians, the Prussians, and eventually the British in the Holy Roman Empire. So the Girondins kind of proposed something. This new political party proposed something that seems sort of outlandish when a country is kind of trying to figure itself out. They proposed that in addition to trying to figure out what kind of government they were going to have, in addition to, writing a new constitution and running their own country, they were going to declare war on some of these traditional foreign enemies. And they were going to go out and, bring the revolution beyond the French borders, to the rest of Europe or whatever. So that was kind of a radical proposal. But they thought that if they could declare war on some of these traditional enemies, that it might actually unify the people of France, it might unify the National Assembly and kind of get them all working in one direction as opposed to fighting every day about, how the government was going to run. The next thing that happened was, and I told you it was going to happen, is that the non-juring priests started to be punished. So the non-juring priests were the priests who refused to sign the civil constitution of the clergy. Okay, they're the ones who maintained that they should obey the Pope before they should obey the National Assembly. So these priests who would stay dedicated to the Roman Catholic Church over the National Assembly started to be punished by the new government of France. So the National Assembly basically said, go out and find these guys and hold them accountable for not signing up to the new, Republic of France. Hold them accountable for not doing what they're supposed to do for their country first and choosing, to continue to obey the Pope over country. So this is a pretty big swing, and it really is the point where another kind of inflection point where you can see that the revolution is going from moderate conservative to a more radical phase. 2 years before, to think that they would punish a priest for not obeying the Pope would have been, crazy. But now they're punishing priests for not obeying or for obeying the Pope, and for not, taking an allegiance to the National Assembly. And then finally, the last part of this notes section is that the king, Louis XVI, he's still in France, right? He's been captured brought back to Paris, and he's still kind of trying to figure out what they're going to do with him. But he suddenly takes a shift and supports the Girondins in their war against the foreign enemies, Austria, Prussia, Holy Roman Empire, and England. And this is kind of a strange thing, since, a couple of months before, he had tried to escape the country to go to Austria. Now he's actually shifting his stance to be pro-war, to being, that the French National Assembly should declare war against these foreign powers. Now, it seems pretty transparent if you actually think about it. First of all, by shifting to a pro-war stance, he's probably trying to ingratiate himself with the National Assembly. I think he's pretty afraid that they're going to, hold him accountable for trying to escape. And so maybe he's trying to ingratiate himself with the National Assembly. But the second thing is that he might be thinking that if France goes to war with these foreign powers, that they'll go in and defeat France and then put him back on the throne. So it might be a pretty cagey thing for him to support the war, in that he thinks it might be the surest way for him to regain power. So that's where we'll end these notes for today. But, if you have any questions, you let me know in class, or you can kind of find me during office hours on Wednesday, 11 to 12. Thanks, and I think that'll be it.